Hi, my name is Gerald Gloade, and I'm here today from the Mi'kmaq de Burgh Cultural Center. Today, the presentation I'm going to be talking about is the 7 districts of Mi'kma'ki, and that goes to our Mi'kmaq language, and it being a verb-based language, I'm going to be giving you a lot of samples of some of the words in our vocabulary, and a little bit of a background about the archaeology that we have here in the province of Nova Scotia. Now, the first and oldest dated archaeological site that we have here in the province of Nova Scotia is at Mi'kmaq de Burgh, an archaeological site on a former military base. Now, back in 1948, the Dean of the Agricultural College in Bible Hill, Mr. Ernest Eaton, and his wife were out picking blueberries in this area. And this area was being prepared, again, like I said, for a military base. And they were preparing this recreational field, like a soccer field and a softball field. And when they leveled the ground off, Mr. Eaton had found some artifacts. Now, he had a bit of a background in archaeology, so he knew the significance of what he was looking at. Looking at that projectile point in the middle of the screen there, it's a Clovis point. And when you see something that's fashioned in that style and that technique of the day, you're going back some 9,000 to 14,000 years. He knew that was very, very significant. And the thing is, 1948, Canada had a higher priority, and that was the military efforts of World War II. The archaeologists, Dr. George MacDonald and his crew, they actually didn't get on site until the 1960s. The image here of Dr. George MacDonald there with the cap on, digging in the sand. This image shows 2 things of significance. One is the sandiness of the soil, and another thing is the depth of the soil, some 50 to 100 centimeters in depth. Now, the site produced some 4,600 formal artifacts, and it also produced thousands and thousands of pieces of debris and debutage that you see sort of on the background of this image. Those are all the little chips that are left behind when you're fashioning a tool out of a piece of stone. And that talks about sort of the geological inventory of the material that we used. Way back in the 1960s, Department of Education was calling this an Indian arrowhead. But the projectile point is actually one of the grandfather of the bow and arrow, and that there's the atlatl and dart system. When you take a look at the Mi'kmaq de Burgh site, we also had fire hearths that were found there. And some of the material in there, we were able to get radiocarbon dated dates from. Dates of about 1,000 years of occupation, some 10.1 thousand years ago to 11.1 thousand years ago. Those are radiocarbon dates. And when you translate those to actual physical calendar days, it represents some 13,300. Another thing is bow and arrow technology is not that old. It's not 13,000 years old. It's basically found in a few continents of the planet here at 6,000 years and at 8,000 years. So at 13,000 years, the atlatl and dart system was the grandfather of the bow and arrow. And again, what you're using is you're using a lever to throw a very, very flexible spear. Take a few pieces of how it works. You're just using the science of leverage as well as stored spring energy. Another thing is with the material that we've had pulled up, there was a lot of dry blood inside the cracks and crevices that we could scrape off. And we had enough blood samples in these projectile points and knife blades to have it analyzed. We sent it off and it came back, it tested positive as caribou. And it said it was not the caribou that we have today, it was the ancestors of the caribou. Now, a lot of people know the word caribou is this deer-like animal that used to live here in Nova Scotia. It's actually been extirpated only since the 1960s. But it is actually a Mi'kmaq word. And the Mi'kmaq word originated from is Kalibu. And it was the ancestor of the Kalibu, which was the stag moose. He was some 150 to 170% larger than the caribou that we have today. And he was our main form of sustenance for meat, bones for tools, intestines and sinew for tying things up, as well as even converting the antlers into workable tools. Moving in here some 13,300 years ago, you're coming in at the edge of the last ice age. This here is a map of North America as we know it today. 13,300, you're facing pretty close to glacial maximum, and the glacial ice went all the way down into Wisconsin in the United States. Now, as the planet started to warm up, the ice field started to recede farther north. And as the ice receded, our people migrated into this area. You can still see evidence of glacial maximum even when you look at the shorelines of the Atlantic Ocean on Google Earth. That was once the shoreline, what you're seeing out there in that light blue area. And because the ice was some 2 kilometers thick, the water levels were much lower. And you can even see right on the edge of that, the erosion lines that go out into the Grand Banks and even off farther. And what we're having is that ice melting, water levels are rising, and the shoreline is definitely changing. So that's where it moved from some 13,000 years ago to where we are today. But again, as things started to melt, the area started to warm up, vegetation started to kick in, the animals were following the food source, and our people were following the food source as well, in the form of the animals. So we moved into this area some 13,300 years ago. Put that into perspective, I know I talked to a lot of school groups. When I was a young fellow going to school myself, we talked about ancient cultures. We studied King Tut in Egypt. And even to find that that was only 3,300 years ago, when here the culture of Nova Scotia and the Mi'kmaq people go back over 13,000 years. That's like 3 times as much as we have here with King Tut, almost 4 times as much. The people that moved into this area, we settled, we were the Wabanaki people. Wabanaki in our verb-based language means people of the dawn or people of the early morning light. And that represents us here in Mi'kma'ki, the land of the Mi'kmaq. It's all of Newfoundland, all of Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, the eastern and central shores of New Brunswick, the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, and even in northern Maine, we have our Mi'kmaq brothers. And we were definitely the first ones to see the morning light. We're in the continent of North America, and we were the first ones to see the rising sun. So that name, Wabanaki, it definitely fit. And it also demonstrates that our people had a very, very strong sense of science and the movement of the planets. This is where we are. We moved into this area and we stayed, and we became the Mi'kmaq people. That's all people are. People are where you come from. Chinese come from China. The Africans come from Africa. The Australians come from Australia. And the Mi'kmaq, we come from this place here. The ones that settled, we took on that name, but some of them moved on. They moved out west. They became the Mohawk, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, the Cree. They're still part of our same brotherhood, and they even still speak the same language. That Algonquian family of languages, there's 55 different tribes that share a language throughout North America. Now, what you're looking at here is a picture of our map. It has the contemporary names of the provinces that we celebrate here in Canada, as well as the old traditional names. When you look at Newfoundland, it was once joined in a district with Cape Breton Island, and it was called Tecumseh. We had another joined district, which was Prince Edward Island. It was joined with the counties of Pictou and Antigonish County, and it was called Abiguadac-Pictou. Now, when you're looking at these areas of Eskigaweg, Sibiganakadik, Gespaweg, they say a lot just in the words that they have. When you go down to the valley of Nova Scotia, you got Gespaweg. And Gespaweg means surrounded by water. You come to the end of land. There's water all the way around you. When you go all the way up to the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec, that's Gespaweg. Gespaweg in the Mi'kmaq language sounds very similar to Gespaweg, but Gespaweg means the end of our land or the end of our territory. You go beyond that, you're running into the Mohawks and the Iroquois. Sicknick is the area between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and even that sort of south coastal area of the province of New Brunswick. Sicknick in our Mi'kmaq language means marshy area. This is an image of the Tantrapar Marsh. If you're going across from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick, you're definitely passing through this area, as well as even across the shores to the St. John River Valley and how marshy it is over in that area. So Sicknick definitely describes where it is. Eskigaweg, you take a look at that, and especially looking at the elevation lines, there are a few little valleys that cut through the lands, but it's almost like a plateau. It's pretty flat. There's not a lot of mountains in there. There's not a lot of deep, deep valleys. And Eskigaweg means skin dressers territory. And it doesn't just represent this preparation of animal hides for clothing. It talks about the migrational path of the caribou that once used to live through here. And again, an animal is not someone who's going to waste their energy climbing over mountains and down deep into the valleys. They're going to stick to the plateau areas when they make their move. Abigwet is our name for Prince Edward Island, and Abigwet means a small piece of land that sits out in the bay. You can physically see that that's what it describes. Takamcook is Newfoundland, and that there is a large piece of land that sets out into the ocean or sets across the sea. So again, this is our word for Newfoundland, Takamcook, when you see that reference for across. So it's from our point of view. Unamagi, Amagi, just like Mi'kma'ki. Mi'kma'ki means the land of the Mi'kmaq. Unamagi means land of fog. And because of the water currents that are coming from the north, they're very, very cool. And they're hitting the waters that are coming up from the south that are a lot warmer. Cape Breton Island can be very, very foggy a great number of days, more case than the mainland part of Nova Scotia. So to the Mi'kmaq, Unamagi meant land of fog. Sibiganakadik is definitely the land of the sigabin plant. And that was our main source of carbohydrates, and it was our main energy fuel. It grows in the Shubenacadie and Stewiacke rivers, as well as some inland lakes that we have across the province. This is actually the fruit that it bears. It's a type of tuber, but it tastes a lot like a potato. It's just a little more grainy. And it can be mashed, it can be grilled, fried. You can even dice it up into, fry it up into potato chips if you want. But again, as a carbohydrate, it was our main source of energy. Another common name for this is a rabbit's head. And because the leaves of the plant, they definitely look like the head of a rabbit. Another one is arrowhead. You can see how that could be depicted as looking like an arrowhead. So these are just some other common names. Piktuk. Piktuk is one of those names that we still have today, but a little anglicized. It's called Pictou. And Pictou means a place where ground gases erupt. And taking a look at the geological inventory of Nova Scotia, you can see that that area is very, very full of major fault lines. A little shark fin just before the Canso Causeway, you can see all these black lines. They show that there's a lot of movement, a lot of creation to make that little piece of land in Pictou. And it's still volcanically active today. Like, I mean, they get a lot of tremors over there in Pictou County and Antigonish County. We have a character in our culture by the name of Jepichkum, and Jepichkum is the great horned serpent. He lives underneath the ground, and whenever he moves, the ground shakes. The zigzag patterns in the ground look like a slithering path of a serpent. And you can see the yellow and red horn flashing from the earth's crusts. They also say that if you're unfortunate to stay long enough, you're going to hear the hissing of the serpent, that hissing sound that we have. What our adults were trying to do was put the image of this character in the minds of our children, so that way they knew how to deal with land changes. Nova Scotia full of fault lines all over the province during our time here in the past 13,000 years. It did rock, roll, and rumble. It did create earthquakes as well as volcanic fault lines opening out with liquid material coming out. And then again, when it comes to the hissing sound of the serpent, those are literally the hissing sounds of toxic gases being released from the Earth's crust. These changes in land can be seen all over places in the province, and some of these are not as old as you'd think. Changes like this in the Minas Basin of the Bay of Fundy, they literally happened only 6,000 years ago. If you go to the Fundy Geological Museum and they talk about the ripping of the Minas Basin geofracture, these are some of the changes that happened there, and the layers of material that was poured out, hit the water and cooled, and then the other layer would pour out over it. So you can see examples of how it was created. Our people were here during that time when this liquid rock was being crunched and folded and sort of left to cool right on the shorelines of the water. And even what I could do today is I could take us for a drive on a bus, and I could take us to this beautiful beach. Nice sandy beach. There's a lot of beach vegetation there. Even the rocks that you'll find on this little beach, they've been cobbled by the world's highest tides here in Nova Scotia, and they're nice and round. And the thing is, this beach is 150 feet in the air. And again, during the creation of the Minas Basin fracture, you've got these tectonic plates pushing together, and so much force that they literally pop up. Now, right under this shoreline, you can see the volcanic basalt. And when you look down at the material that is still on the water, the volcanic basalt is still at water's level. So there's definitely been a change in elevation. And the thing is, when you got changes in elevation, you've got changes in the movement of the water. And that's evident in our inventory of stories. We got a story that talks about the times the rivers flowed backwards. If you got a little brook that flows into a creek, that's going to flow downstream into a river, and that river is going to flow off to the shoreline where it meets on the shoreline. All of a sudden, where it meets on that shoreline is now 150 feet in the air. Then, of course, water is going to change its directions. It will run backwards. So this was our people's record of that point in time, going back some 6,000 years. Even when you look at the material that was created from there, what happens is the earth literally cracks up. The material underneath is liquid, and when it comes up to the surface and it cools, it forms this volcanic basalt that forms cracks as it's drying. Now, depending on the minerals that are in the soil on these cracks, these will crystallize and they will grow, and they'll produce in different colors. All of these samples that you're seeing here are coming from Partridge Island. They're pieces of agates, pieces of quartzite, different types of material that was created here in the Bay of Fundy and along the Minas Basin. And they represent the inventory of stones that we use to make tools. These are very, very hard on what's called the Mosh scale. A Mosh scale rates stones from a 0, which is like a talc or a baby powder, to a 10 out of 10. Now, 10 out of 10 is like a diamond. So any of this material that you're finding, these semi-precious jewels, they're about 7, 8, 9, or 10. They're very, very hard on the Mosh scale. And when you create a tool out of them, they keep their edge for a long time. Like We're digging these artifacts up some 13,000 years later, and they're just as sharp as the day that they were created. And you see hide scrapers for scraping off the hair off of hides in order to make pliable leather. You flip it over, you scrape off the dry fat, and then you've got something that you can work with. These ones here are all bone wedges created from agates, and those are not just chips off of a stone. Those are literally created by hand. And someone has primary, secondary, and tertiary flaking. They're all about the same size. And again, what you're using these bone wedges for is creating tools from bone by sticking this on the bone and smashing it with another rock. Now, because this material is the hardest material in the formula, they don't break. Like the stones, the hammer stones you use to smash them, and the only thing that breaks is the bone. And again, coming from Partridge Island, when you go there, you're not going to find anything about Glooscap, and you're not going to find anything about the architectural or archaeological use of the stones that you find there. Partridge Island is about 2 kilometers from the town of Parsboro, and it's all about the geology. And again, when you take a look at the bottom paragraph there in this little sign, it says, on the shoreline can be found rock and sediment ranging in origin from 300 to 175 million years ago. And among these materials can be found samples of nearly every mineral in the world. So again, taking a look at the geological inventory of the province, you can see it changes from one place to another. And when our planet was combined into one large continent, the continent of Pangaea, it broke off into the 7 continents that we know today. And Nova Scotia was pretty well smack dab in the middle of it. And when you take a look at how these materials were created by volcanic fusion, if I take a bucket of sand and I expose it to high heat, I'm going to get glass. And that's the same thing when you take the shoreline of beach sand and expose it to high glass. You look behind my son's head, you'll see volcanic basalt in the form of liquid material, so hot that it would melt stone. It has melted the stony beach that it sort of sits beside, and it forms volcanic glass. And it's that material that we use to make tools from, because it's very desirable to work with. It's very predictable to work with when you're flint knapping and creating tools from it. You see the concordal fractures that it does when you smack it with another rock. It breaks off very, very predictably. And again, just by using that 40-degree angle, you're going to be able to send fractures through to give you the desired shape you need for certain tools. It's something that people have done all over the planet. I get a lot of time that's like an Indian arrowhead, and I'm like, everybody had arrowheads at one time. Everybody went through the Stone Age at one time. And these are not specifically just Indian arrowheads. It's just the terminology that we use. What we had done was we had taken all the archaeological material that we found from the province that comes from different ages of our occupation here in the province. We took it to Mr. Eldon George, and we weren't asking Eldon what age they were or what time period they came from. What we wanted to know from Eldon was, what kind of stone is this, and where do you find it here in Nova Scotia? I'll give you a sample of that. This was an artifact that was passed in. It was actually found at Dollar Lake, Nova Scotia Provincial Park, in behind the airport. And it's made of like a red jasper, and it's got veins of this green jadeite material through it. We found this stone at the archaeological site in Debert. And my son actually found it when he was working archaeology, working his way through college. He brought that home and said, "Hey, Dad, this looks pretty cool." And I said, that's a tool. I said, "Take that back." And my son basically dug it up, thought I'd like it. And I'm like, "No, you got to return that back to the site." Because you can see that our ancestors were going out onto the land, gathering material, bringing it back to their communities, and fashioning tools out of it. Now, the thing is that projectile point, it came from Halifax County. That material geologically is not going to be found in Halifax County. The core sample itself comes from Colchester County. And again, that material doesn't originate from Colchester County. So what we had done was we recruited Mr. Eldon George to work on a project with us to take us to the sites where our materials come from. Now, in this picture, you see Mr. Eldon George working his way through a creek. You see Mr. Roger Lewis, the Nova Scotia provincial ethnographer at the Nova Scotia Museum of Natural History down in Halifax. And my wife, Natalie Gloade, who is a heritage interpreter for 4 years, she came out on the field trips a lot with us to do a lot of our research. And again, what we did was we mapped the location of the archaeological material, and we also mapped the source sites of where it comes from. And as soon as we put that on a map, you could see evidence of trade as well as travel ways of our people from how those materials got from one place to the other. We did that project with sort of even looking at the place names in Nova Scotia and the ones that come from the Glooscap legends. Now, the Glooscap legends, what they did was they took traditional knowledge and ecological knowledge, they embedded it in story form and passed these stories on, so the information went with them. And again, a lot of these sites refer to places where you're going to find sites of cultural significance and material of cultural significance. These are being major fault lines in Nova Scotia, the Minas Basin geofracture and the Cobequid fault lines. And these were a lot of the semi-precious jewels are being created and still found today. Even when you look at the Minas Basin, the north side and the south side of it are so full of Glooscap legends and stories that the tourism industry since the 1930s have been calling that the Glooscap Trail. And when you take a look at all these sites that you see on the map on both sides of the Minas Basin, you're going to find semi-precious jewels that our ancestors used to make tools. And for every single one of these sites, I can tell you a Glooscap legend. The information is embedded in the stories. These again represent the two major fault lines that run through the province and the material that was created and left there. This is basically the roadmap of how we get around Nova Scotia today. But back 13,000 years ago, our ancestors used the waterways. And you can even see that there's no place you can't get to by water throughout the province of Nova Scotia. One of the exercises I actually do with the children is I ask them to map how many times you're on your way from your home to your school, how many times do you cross over water? And it definitely gives them a realization that there is more water than asphalt here in the province of Nova Scotia. That's because our ancestors traveled the waterways in vessels like birch bark canoes, and even portaging from one area to another. We definitely had an intimate knowledge and relationship to the stones that are coming from this area. Even today in contemporary format, we've got stories of our people traveling still through the waterways. And again, when you're traveling the waterways, whether it be coastal or through the interior, you're finding these outcrops of volcanic material. When a Mi'kmaq person sees these places, we know that these are the places that the ancestors were given gifts that were left by the Creator. We've got places of volcanic basalt that have changed the materials around it into very desirable material. This is Arisag, near Arisag Provincial Park in Antigonish County. The volcanic basalts there produce a lot of amazing material. Down in Briar Island, you get the columnar basalts that represent the material that has been raised from the Earth's crust and pushed up as liquid material coming up from these cracks. Cape Chignecto, you see the columns of volcanic basalt there. All that matrixing material that encrusts this has been washed away by the world's highest tides here in the Bay of Fundy, and all you're left with is that very, very hard material in the form of volcanic basalts. Cape Door, again, the columnar basalts there, and even Horseshoe Cove, where you can see that these cracks and crevices have been exposed and volcanic material has come out from the Earth's crust there. Scott's Bay, the pelobasalts that are there and the material that have been created are very, very desirable for making tools. One of our known source sites for geological material comes from the Scott's Bay area. And again, I shared with you Cape Split and the volcanic material that has been pushed up from these tectonic plates, again, within the Bay of Fundy. Partridge Island, one of my favorite places. It was a piece of land that was laid out over time from top to bottom. But when that material ripped open, it flipped it over on its side. So you can literally walk back in history from 300 million years ago to 175 million years ago. As you walk across the island, you'll see the different material that was created. Five Islands, it does the same thing again on Long Island. The volcanic basalts there and the agates that are created, beautiful stones for making jewelry. And again, this is what you're sort of looking for. You see those concordal fractures, you know that is very desirable. Then you literally see the beaches totally full of this material. You know that that place was significant to our ancestors. Knowing that just like a piece of amethyst the size of your fingernail is worth about $5 on the internet, I'd love to know what this piece is worth, because it literally fell off the mountainside. It is full of agate, it's full of jasper, it's full of amethyst, it's full of quartzite. And again, a lapidarian or somebody who makes jewelry out of semi-precious stones, this would literally be worth hundreds of thousands to them. And it just sits there on a beach in Nova Scotia. And you talk about the Binus Basin, a very, very cultural part of our story. We talk about the creation story of the Mi'kmaq people being created by 3 bolts of lightning. The first bolt of lightning put him in the shape of a man. The second bolt of lightning brought him to life, but he was still fastened to the ground, and all he could do was observe and learn. The third bolt of lightning set him free, so he could take his teachings out to the people and the animals and teach them how they're to cohabitate here in Mi'kmaq. So it's a big part of our story. We talk about one of the most famous stories that we have is probably the legend of 5 Islands, and how Glooskap threw 5 sods of stone at giant beaver to get him out from his area here in Mi'kmaq. We got the 3 sisters, these 3 pillars of volcanic basalt. They say that these 3 sisters were playing a prank on Glooskap, and Glooskap was hunting a moose, but these 3 sisters kept running the moose off farther and farther, making it harder for Glooskap to catch up with them. When he found out what the sisters were doing, he turned them to stone, and they're up there in Cape Chignecto area in a rock formation that's called the 3 Sisters. Then we've even got our departure story, where Glooskap left our people. He gifted a whale a pipe for taking him to new lands to spread our word of our culture. And even today, when you're out on a whale watch and you see that little whale blow, that little puff, it's like that's the smoke from Glooskap's pipe that you're seeing. So these are all part of our legends and stories. I talk about the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights, being the spirits of our ancestors, running back and forth, playing lacrosse in the skies. We talk about the water in the Bay of Fundy being very, very wily, because there's an eternal battle going on between 2 bottom dwellers, which are a lobster and an eel. So the culture is definitely there. The stories are there. Dresswood Haven, a place where we say that there was a giant beaver dam that was causing droughts in one area and flooding in another. And Glooskap recruited the whale to bust up that giant beaver dam. We have stories about Glooskap losing a battle with the god of winter, and that it was wintry here year-round again. We have stories of Glooskap creating an amethyst necklace for his grandmother at Partridge Island. And sure enough, you go to Partridge Island, you're going to find samples of amethyst. It's site-specific. These are some of the samples of the amethyst you'll find at Partridge Island and even across the bay at Cape Blomidon. We have another story about Glooskap's grandmother having a magic cooking pot. And she was always ready to accept company. And what she'd do is people would come, she'd serve them food, you'd cut off a piece of stew meat, it would just grow back. So this magic cooking pot idea at Partridge Island, it's full of volcanic basalt that has come up and cooled when it hit the water. And there's channels and air holes in there. So what happens twice a day, every day, when the world's highest tides come in, the water pushes the air out of the rocks in there, and the water boils and bubbles like a cooking pot all the way around the island. And again, going back to that story of Jepichkum, the great horned serpent, and the changes of land, and the story that we sort of left behind so the kids would know whenever there was any movement of the earth, any rumbling, think of this creature and get out of town. It's like you see it crack open. It's like, think of this creature and get away from there. It's because of the progressive events that happen is only going to lead to the release of toxic gases coming from the Earth's surface that will definitely harm you. So these are a lot of our lessons, our stories, our ancestral heights, our sites throughout the province of Nova Scotia. And they're definitely still there, something to explore. If your classroom has an opportunity to get out onto the landscape, it's a great time for any type of outdoor learning. I know even during these COVID times right now, people are encouraged to get out onto the land. So these again are our stories, and I guess that's the end of our presentation. So thank you very much.